speak, you know, I'm not only a grandfather, but I'm also a great-grandfather but I'll try not to look so old and to behave and to give you things, you know, which I think, I mean, because I'm old, you know, I kind of foresaw a lot of these things, I mean, 10 years ago, and I think now is the time when a lot of the things that we start to do in Montreal, where I was 10 years ago, are start now really to be happen and probably will be published, I think, this year. So, so my lab is very much focused on trying to understand the immune response. And we have a very agnostic, holistic approach to these studies, because what we decided and what we know is that we don't know what we don't know, so we look at everything. So, because for many years, you know, we tried, I mean, we thought we knew a lot of things, and a lot of things panned out not to be right. And so at one point in my life, I decided, well, this is not the right way to do science, and instead of, you know, trying to do science in a very focused, hypothesis-driven way, we decided to be completely agnostic and to measure everything that we could measure, because, I mean, all these omics technologies start to make way and start to be less and less invasive, and then allowed us, I mean, to really do focused interventions that I think will make a very big difference in the way that we treat people, because what at the end of the day I want to do, and what we want to do in my lab, is to make treatment better so we can cure HIV, but also in my lab there's a big group that also work on curing cancer, because of immunotherapies are getting more and more intervening in cancer. And what I show you today, in fact, the IL-10 work that we are presenting now, which is dealing with HIV persistent, you can overlap and change the same slide I have and show the same effect during cancer and cancer treatment. So in fact, I mean, the molecule that you're studying, IL-10, the first interventions that are going to treat people with an anti-IL-10 antibody are in cancer. And I think, I mean, there's a very strong dialogue between the two diseases, because, I mean, the two diseases lead to immune dysfunction by very, very similar mechanisms. So, for a number of years, I mean, again, 10 years, a lot of the studies started in Montreal. I've been very focused on trying to understand how HIV, the reservoir gets established, because, as you know, it's a major impediment to HIV eradication. And there's a lot of challenges to HIV eradication, especially when you see them as a virologist and as you see them as immunologists. And at one point, you know, I think it's going to be very important for those two disciplines to work together, because I think, I mean, yes, it's a virus, but I think a lot of the treatment that are going to make headways are going to be treatment that involve immune restoration and immune intervention. So the first challenge that we have is that the virus, when you talk about the reservoir, I mean, the virus is latent, meaning that's invisible. So if the immune system, which is the response that is dealing with removing virally infected cells, the immune system cannot do anything if you don't see a virus. So we have to try to make the virus visible, and that's, I think, a very big challenge. I think you'll hear about it from Susan and from Mathieu, I'm sure. So I mean, that's one challenge, is how to make the virus visible. The second thing, I mean, the second challenge that a lot of the big companies that started to look at ways, I mean, to make the virus visible, focus their effort on small molecules and molecules, you know, that targeted very specific pathways, like the epigenetics and histodeacetylation. And in fact, I mean, none of these pathways or none of the interventions led to anything significant. So I think at one point, I mean, I think people start to go back a little bit and start to think, you know, that maybe we need to try some other interventions. And I think, I mean, the big companies, but also the academic sector, is embracing now biologics as a way, I mean, to try to make the virus visible, because at the end of the day, what you want to do is try to activate a cell or increase the cell metabolism in a cell, so that now, I mean, HIV, that cell now can remove from latency and now start to be active, and eventually the virus gets reactivated. The second point, in fact, which I think I'm very proud to know that Nicolas Chaumont in my lab 10 years ago brought, I think, significant light, was the fact to me that the reservoir is very diverse. It's very diverse, meaning that the reservoir gets established in many different cell types, a lot of them are lymphocytes. I mean, central memory, effector memory, stem cell memory, and all these cells, they're all T cells. They all look round. They all look small. They all look very boring. But at the end of the day, they're extremely different because a central memory is a cell that's very, very small, metabolically inactive. It just lives because it has a lot of oxidative phosphorylation and lipolysis. And if you look at an effector memory cell, it's a cell that's completely different. It's a cell that's very metabolically active, that's very glycolytic, and it's almost like an activated T cell. And so when you want to think about how you're going to reactivate the virus or in those two cell types, you're going to employ two very different strategies in order to make the viral reactivate. So thinking, that there's a one recipe for all, that you're going to be able to reactivate the virus in all different cell types using a single approach, I think is a bit far-fetched. The second thing is that, so you need to think about involving very different strategies. And the third point, I think, which a lot of people miss when we start to talk about HIV education, was that hard treatment does not restore immune responses. It restored to some extent CD4 numbers, but HIV-specific T cells, trained immunity, innate immunity, they are not restored. I mean, 10 years later, after you treat an HIV-infected subject with and you try to make T cells or macrophages make IL-1 or make several innate immune responses, they don't make innate immune responses, which are absolutely essential to trigger a T cell response. So, that was not part of at all of the picture when we started to talk about HIV education, but I'm glad to see that now people are talking about TLR ligands and other strategies to start to eventually reset the innate immunity and eventually restore immune response. So these are three major challenges. We don't have a visible virus. We need to reactivate. The way that we can reactivate the virus in different T cells is very different, and so we need to think about different strategies potentially. And then we also have to think about restoring immune function. So how do we go about this? So I mentioned to you, when we decided that we wanted to invest our efforts into this field, we decided that we are going to start by saying, we don't know what we don't know, so we're going to look at everything. So 10 years ago, Frank Dupuy in my lab did a simple experiment where he used Luminex, a Luminex kit at a time, and he looked at several cytokines which are present in the plasma of virally infected hard-to-treat subjects, and tried to identify some cytokines which correlated with the reservoir, with the measure that you had at the time, that was integrated DNA. And in fact, the only cytokine that he was able to find as being correlated to integrated DNA with a significant p-value was IL-10. We looked at many cytokines, which are more than what you have here, about 20 different cytokines, and the only one that was correlated with integrated DNA was this one. Soluble CD14 was also correlated to integrated DNA, but of course, there's only cytokine. So IL-10 was the only cytokine that was enriched in HIV-infected subject that was positively associated with integrated DNA. And of course, the second thing that we do in my lab is that we look at the whole transcriptome of hard-to-treat subjects, and we correlate transcriptional profiles with integrated DNA using linear regression models. And again, among the pathways that correlated with integrated DNA was the IL-10 signaling pathways. There's many other pathways. Some of them are upstream of the IL-10 signaling pathway, like the aryl hydrocarbon receptor pathway. But IL-10 signaling pathway, very much like cytokine, was the direct correlate of HIV integrated DNA. So we also use TILDA, which is another assay that also can identify cells that have integrated DNA using now reactivation. And again, IL-10 was also correlated with TILDA values. So what is IL-10? So IL-10 is a when I started to work on to hear about IL-10 or to learn about IL-10 25 years ago, it was a very, very different molecule than what you know now. IL-10 at that time was a molecule that was supposed to be important for B cell development, for Th1, Th2 differentiation. It was classified as a Th2 cytokine, but now I think if you look at the literature, it's a molecule that's involved in more and more functions. And one thing which is very important, and the way you need to classify IL-10, it's a molecule that has immune regulatory functions. And the fact that it's expressed by Tregs, it really suggests that it's a molecule that's involved in regulating immune function, and not only in Th1, Th2 bias, but more in fact in dictating how the immune response is going to happen. And if you, in fact, you want to look at IL-10 and compare IL-10 to IL-1, you can think, that IL-1 is a molecule, is a cytokine that has very strong pro-inflammatory activity, while IL-10 is there to counterbalance, and IL-10 is a molecule that has an anti-inflammatory function. So IL-10 is triggered by several ligands. It's triggered by LPS, through TLR, by many other TLR ligands, but also by apoptotic bodies. And it's a molecule that, in fact, counterbalance IL-12, but most importantly, it counterbalance IL-1. So IL-1, if you take a balance, you have IL-1 on one side, you have IL-10 on the other side. When IL-1 is high, IL-10 immediately goes up because you want to make a balance between pro-inflammation and anti-inflammation. So, because it's a molecule that's so important in the immune response because it has this tremendous regulatory function, it's a molecule that is produced by many different cell types. It's produced by B cells. In fact, it's a B cell survival, B cell growth factor. It's produced by monocytes upon TLR ligation. It's produced by TFH, and it's important, as you'll see, in TFH differentiation. And it's also important, it's produced by both by classical Tregs and also by TR1s. TR1s are Tregs that make only IL-10. Classical Tregs most make both TGF-beta and Tregs. So it has, as you can see, it's made by many different cell types, and that suggests that it has very important regulatory functions. Molecularly, IL-10 binds to an IL-10 receptor, which is a heterodimeric receptor. It shares chains with IL-6, with IL-21, with oncostatin, and transcriptionally, STAT3 is the transcription factor that, in fact, triggers the whole IL-10 response and really triggers the production or the expression of many different molecules that have anti-inflammatory activity, but as you'll see, have a very wide range of activities going from activities that regulate cell metabolism, activities that regulate epigenetics pathways, activities that regulate T-cell function, and so on and so forth. So what I'll show you, after you see this slide, maybe you're bored and you want to get out. But at least you'll capture what I want to see, what I want to show you. I'll show you, in fact, that IL-10 contributes to the maintenance and the establishment of a reservoir by different pathways. I mentioned to you, IL-10 is pleiotropic. It acts on many different pathways, and so the first pathway I'll show you, it behaves. It acts on survival of infected cells. So an infected cell that's present in the presence of IL-10 will not die. It will continue to release virus and infect bystander cells. IL-10 induces the expression of co-inhibitory receptors like PD-1, like LAG3, like CTLA4. All these molecules are transcriptionally regulated by IL-10. And also it triggers HDAC, but also EZH2, and many molecules that regulate cell activation, cell quiescence through epigenetic mechanisms. It also regulates cell metabolism, and I'll show you data that it regulates, in fact, OXPHOS, which is a major energy source for quiescent cells. And I think something very novel that Susan Ribeiro is here has also been able to show and identify is that it induces, also it regulates the differentiation of TFH cells. And as you know, TFH cells are a major reservoir for HIV. So we start to do the experiment. So after we show you that both by cytokine and by gene expression, the IL-10 pathways was involved in regulation of HIV reservoir. We developed assays in which now we can test and the activity of the cytokines on the establishment and the maintenance of latency, and also because that would allow us now to molecularly dissect those mechanisms by using CRISPR-Cas9 or other approaches where you can, target that pathway and knock down all the genes which are involved in this pathway. So, the way this assay, which is called LARA, is very simple. It's an assay that allows us, where we sort or we enrich for resting memory T cells. We infect them by speculation with HIV, so no activation. We just infect them. We put them in a presence of protease inhibitor to limit to single infection rounds. And then we add molecules like TGF-beta, like IL-10, and look at, and we can keep those cells for up to 3 weeks, even longer. And eventually, after 3 weeks, we can now reactivate the cells and see where, and monitor HIV reactivation by looking at P24, by looking also at an assay that Susan has developed, which is to look at budding virus staining for GP120 on the surface of cells. What this assay is great for, not that it's an assay where you can dissect every single molecular pathway we put our hands on, but this assay allows us to look at establishment of a reservoir in different memory subsets, which gets to the point which I mentioned before. If you want to, if you're serious about eradicating HIV, you have to treat each memory subset individually, and that assay allows now to monitor each individual memory subset. So, what Susan did first is to put HIV in the presence of those resting memory CD4 cells, and lo and behold, what she was able to show is that after putting the cells in the presence of HIV, she was gradually showing gradual and increasing production of IL-10. So the same molecule that is going to be involved in the injection of HIV is in fact induced by HIV. If now we look at P24 positive cells in the presence of increasing amount of IL-10, you can see that this is non-simulated, and when you add now increasing levels of IL-10, you can see, in fact, that you get more and more P24 cells producing P24 or P24 positive cells 3 days after infection, and in fact is a bit slightly higher even than when you treat your cells with CD3, CD28. So then, I mean, if now you look at the if you now keep those cells for 2 weeks in IL-10, you can see that, I mean, the expression of P24 in CD4 positive cells, in CD4 negative cells, because HIV infection leads to downregulation of CD4, you can see that the frequency of CD4 of P24 cells goes down, again, with the idea that IL-10 induces HIV latency by downregulating HIV replication. And when you reactivate now HIV, you can look, in fact, that compared to IL-7, which is another molecule that can maintain HIV replication, you can see that reactivation of T cells with CD28 compared to IL-10, compared to IL-7, IL-10 is even makes latency more profound than IL-7, and that's because, I mean, as you'll see, the mechanism which I will describe to you in a minute. So we went back now to ex vivo experiment and look at infected subjects under treatment. Those subjects were treated for at least 3 years. And now we looked at IL-10 in the plasma of those subjects. We showed that IL-10 was expressed at much higher level in the plasma of those infected subjects. And not only IL-10, but also the IL-10 receptor was expressed at much higher level, a significantly higher level in HIV subjects as compared to HIV-negative healthy controls. And more importantly, we could see, in fact, that both IL-10 and IL-10 receptor both correlated positively with level of integrated DNA. So in HIV-infected HIV subjects, the machinery that is involved in IL-10 signaling, the cytokine itself and its receptor were both correlated to integrated DNA. So then we did what we do best in my lab, which is, I mean, now to go and now to try to figure out, so how IL-10 does its job. So the first thing we did is to see whether there was a signature, gene expression signature that was common between IL-10 and integrated DNA. So IL-10 levels are depicted in blue here. So the darker the blue is, the more IL-10. The darker the red is, the more integrated DNA. And you can see, in fact, I mean, that there's this there's a signature that is clearly discriminates between the high AL10 and the high integrated DNA subjects. That is all the genes are here. And when you look at the low integrated DNA, the low AL10 values, there's a different signature that you see being expressed in these parts of the heat map. So, of course, you generate a heat map. It tells you, well, I mean, things are different. But, of course, if you want to push further and you want to figure out what are the signatures about, now you look at pathways. You look at biological pathways. Biological pathways are more than lists of genes. They really describe biological processes. And the first biological process that you see was STAT3 signaling. So I mentioned to you IL-10 signaling of STAT3. So the genes which are differentially expressed between high and low integrated DNA or high or low IL-10 include the first transcript factor that involved in IL-10 signaling, which is STAT3. But you also see, we also saw pathway involved in survival. We saw, as I mentioned to you, pathway involved in upregulation of aldoscone receptor, pathways involved in epigenetic reprogramming, and pathway involved in TFH differentiation. All these pathways clearly defined very well. I mean, subjects that have low IL-10 and low reservoir, and high IL-10 and high reservoir. And I just show you here, in fact, is that when you look at all these the genes involved in all these pathways, the survival pathway like BCL2, like JAK2, the PD-1 signaling pathway, the TFH pathway, and the chromatin remodeling, all these pathways are being regulated by STAT3, the major transcript factor that is downstream of IL-10. So, and then, of course, we were wondering what was upstream of IL-10, and I mentioned to you that TLI ligation can trigger IL-10. In fact, what we saw was also a very strong correlation between plasma level of soluble CD14 and plasma level of IL-10, suggesting that TLI ligation, including LPS, could be an event that might involve the trigger of IL-10 production. And you all know the work of Danny Dweck, I mean, that shows gut dysbiosis and bacterial classification. So that bacterial classification can very well be associated to the increased level of IL-10. And because in my lab, like I said, we look at everything. We not only look at transcription and not only cytokines, but we also look at plasma metabolites, which are very strong inducers of cell differentiation, cell activation. They're very strong second messengers. We found, in fact, that there was butyrates, which were, again, correlated very highly to levels of IL-10 and also to frequency of Tregs. And I'll get back to that. So butyrate is a molecule that is a metabolite that Hiroshi Ono, but also Sasha Rudensky, published papers in Nature about 5 years ago showing that this common micro-derived butyrate, which we show is very strongly correlated to IL-10 expression, IL-10 production triggers the differentiation of Tregs, and that I think starts to give us clues about the mechanism by which IL-10 is being produced and by which you can establish eventually latency. So you probably all know Tregs, but just to repeat it to you, you have, like I mentioned earlier, TR1 cells that can be defined in human by the expression of LAG3 and CD49B. And those cells are bona fide cells that make IL-10. They are FOXP3 negative. So in contrast to other Tregs, these are FOXP3 negative. But also you have the classical iTregs, which, when I started to work in immunology in 1984, they were classified mostly as Th3 by Howard Weiner. And those cells, are cells that make both TGF-beta and IL-10, and they're also CTLA-4 positive and PD-1 and PD-1 negative. So, already from those first year experiments, I mentioned to you that soluble CD14, which are related to bacterial classification, can trigger IL-10 in monocytes, but also butyrate can eventually also trigger the differentiation of Tregs and TR1 cells that can also eventually make IL-10. So So then now we wanted to have a way by which now we have those signatures, we had those both transcriptional, cytokine, and metabolic signature. Now everything comes about validation. It's great to have a signature, but if you're not able to validate it in vitro or molecularly, it doesn't help. You really want to make sure that the genes that you've been able to identify in your signature are genes which are eventually associated with the phenotype that you are monitoring. So what we took, and it was Franck Dupuis in my lab, still in Montreal, about 10 years ago, did was to take now purified memory cells, put them in the presence of IL-10 for 3 hours and 12 hours, and then we performed gene expression by gene array at the time, and we defined a signature that was specifically triggered by IL-10, which, of course, as you can imagine, involved STAT3 targets, which, as I mentioned to you, is the transcription factor that mediates most of IL-10 signaling. And now if you look at the functions which are being triggered by IL-10, they include, again, survival. They include PD-1 signaling. They include T-cell exhaustion and quiescence. They include HDAC and chromatin modification. And they include cell metabolism and TFA signaling. So a lot of signatures that we had seen in vivo, ex vivo, on cells from HIV-infected subjects and were correlated with IL-10 expression in the plasma of the subject, we can induce in vitro by taking memory CD4 T cells, put them in the presence of IL-10, and show, in fact, that those genes are correlated, are being specifically triggered by IL-10. And now, if you want to look at the gene downstream of IL-10 or gene which are regulated by STAT3, again, the transcription factor that is triggered IL-10, you can see that they're very highly correlated to integrated DNA and to plasma levels of IL-10. So again, we are able to recapitulate in vitro whatever we were able to find ex vivo using cells from HIV-infected subjects. So now starts, the real validation, which is now to look molecularly and at the cell level for each one of those pathways: survival, exhaustion, viral application, TFH deposition. So that's now where we start to use our in vitro systems. So the first pathway that we focus our efforts on is survival. Why? Because if you have a cell that is infected, and now you have IL-10 around, and IL-10 is going to augment the survival of infected cells. Now that infected cells can go and keep on producing HIV, and that HIV can now go on and infect other activated T cells, and those activated T cells can eventually become, again, a new source of HIV as well. So we saw that, again, if you look at correlation between integrated DNA, correlation with IL-10, you can see all these pathways involved in survival. And in fact, just to show you that when you put IL-10 in the presence of infected cells that make HIV, you can see, in fact, that the more IL-10 you have, the more you can collect or quantify P24 in the supernatant of those cells, again confirming that IL-10 is allowing the survival of infected cells. So we looked at, we generated, and again, that's the work of Franck, we generated a vector that had GFP, and we looked at the expression of GFP in the presence of increasing levels of IL-10. So the first thing that we looked at absolute number of activated cells, which can support HIV replication. And you can see that the more IL-10 you add, the more CD25 positives you have. The more IL-10 you have, the more HLA-DR, so CD38 positive CD4 T cells you have. And the more IL-10 you add, the more GFP positive cells you have. And those cells are cells which are infected and which support HIV replication. And now when we look at the correlation between XIII positive cells or HLA-DR 38 positive cells, and you correlate them with IL-10 values or IL-10 receptor values, and correlate them with integrated DNA, you can see, in fact, that XIII, HLA-DR 38 cells, as expected from our in vitro experiment, also correlate very well with integrated DNA. So, I mean, the reverse of that experiment now is to show, that when you add IL-10, I mean, you can increase the expression of molecules which are involved in apoptosis or in protecting cells from apoptosis, like BCL2. So if you add IL-10 here and you had a non-control control antibody like IgG2, you can see that you increase the level of BCL2, and now we have an antibody to IL-10 receptor. Or an antibody to IL-10, you can see that now you can bring down the level of BCL2, and this is shown here in a clinical fashion, that the frequency of BCL2 positive cells increases with time after addition of IL-10, and it gets down when you add now an anti-IL-10. So one of the major mechanisms that involve the increasing cell survival, which is upregulation of anti-apoptotic molecules like BCL2, is being triggered by IL-10 and is overcome when you add anti-IL-10. So the second pathway, which I mentioned you, was also very interesting and extremely relevant, which is the co-inhibitory receptors. Is the expression of all these molecules, which are very popular right now, which like CTLA4, like PD-1, like LAG3, like TIM3. All these molecules, as you can see, are very highly expressed or very highly upregulated when you add IL-10. And of course, I mean, that's the negative control, where you clearly see the upregulation. And you can see, in fact, that, again, these molecules, the expression of these 5 genes is a very strong correlate of integrated DNA and also a very strong correlate of IL-10 expression. So these molecules correlate with integrated DNA, correlate with IL-10, and when you take those few genes and you build linear regression models and you look at correlation between all these molecules and integrated DNA or IL-10, you see that the more of these molecules express, the more integrated DNA you get, and the more IL-10 you're going to get. So it told us, I mean, again, that whatever we saw ex vivo or in vitro is now we can replicate all these events in vitro, by adding IL-10. And in fact, I mean, again, if you now look at if you add IL-10 and now you look at the GFP positive T cells, so cells which are infected by HIV, so the more IL-10 you have, the more GFP positive cells you have within the PD-1 positive compartment, again highlighting the fact that IL-10 increases PD-1 expression, and that allows, I mean, the survival of cells which are infected, which also express PD-1. And now, if you want to do the reverse experiment, which is now to see where by blocking the effect of IL-10, are you now able to block, I mean, the upregulation of PD-1, you can see, again, I mean, that this is with IL-10, this is with anti-IL-10. You can see that you decrease significantly the expression of PD-1 on the surface of these cells. And now if you do a more clever experiment, and now you look at combined expression of several co-inhibitory receptors like PD-1 and LAG3, and you look at where GFP is being expressed, so GFP being a marker of viral replication, you can see that, again, when you add more IL-10, you get more of those double positive cells. Cells express both PD-1 and LAG3. And in fact, I mean, this is gating on GFP positive cells. So most of the GFP positive cells, most of the cells that encompass virus are cells which express PD-1 and LAG3 upon incubation with IL-10. So IL-10 is allowing again, increased viral production in cells that express both PD-1 and LAG3 under the influence of IL-10. And this is now going back ex vivo. If now you take, and this is work that we also published with Nicolas Chaumont and Rémi Fromentin, where we look at the correlation between PD-1, LAG3, and or CTLA4, and integrated DNA, you can see again that there's very strong positive correlation between the expression of these of IL-10 or IL-10 receptor with the expression of all these co-inhibitory receptors. So whatever we are, so at least in an unbiased fashion, using transcriptomics initially, we're able to confirm in vitro upon addition of IL-10 to an in vitro infection system, and now go back ex vivo and show that that IL-10 was correlated to the same measures that we were able to show being involved ex vivo. And then we also looked at marker of the epigenetic, and this is very, where now we looked at expression of HDACs by flow cytometry. Again, we're looking at molecularly at different pathways, which are all involved in, which are all being by IL-10. You can see very clearly that all these pathways which map to HDAC and to other pathways involving chromatin modification, you can see, in fact, that all these pathways are being associated to IL-10, and also, as expected from the work of Eric Verden and many others, are also associated to integrated DNA. But I mean, the most important thing I want to show you is that now we take IL-10, and IL-7 does not do that job, but if you take increasing level of IL-10, you induce HDAC expression, and they can measure quantitative blood flow cytometry in different subsets, and that's again an indication that whatever we can see at the RNA level, we can reproduce at the protein level in the different memory subsets. And in fact, I mean, to confirm this, we looked at the expression of P24 in CD4 negative cells and correlated them with the expression of HDACs. And you can see that the more HDAC you express, the less P24 positive cells you get after incubation for 2 weeks in IL-10. Again, highlighting the fact to me that you need to have IL-10 to induce HDAC inhibition and that HDAC expression, and HDAC expression now is going to be associated to decreased production of P24 and decreased positivity of P24 cells. And again, I mean, this is now related by anti-IL-10 in those in vitro experiments. Another way by which IL-10 can act, and that's again going back to survival, I mentioned to you that OXPHOS, oxidative phosphorylation, is a major mechanism that induces cell survival because oxidative phosphorylation leads to production of ATP, and ATP is a source of energy that allows cells to survive. So if you look at several molecules of the OXPHOS pathway that relate oxidative phosphorylation, they all are correlated with higher levels of integrated DNA, but now if you and also high levels of IL-10. And now if you add IL-10 and now you want to measure specifically OXPHOS in PBMCs, you're able to show that you increase, using the CRO's technology, you increase oxidative phosphorylation, and that again is something that again confirms that IL-10, here it's a correlation, now here it's a direct effect of IL-10 on this metabolic pathway, and you can measure that also by flow cytometry, where now we look at mitogreen, mitorange is a marker of oxidative phosphorylation by flow, and in fact you can see that when you add IL-10, you increase oxidative phosphorylation in central memory, in effector memory, and in traditional memory cells. So again, showing that the effect of IL-10 on the induction latency is something that occurs in most memory subsets. And the final data I'm going to show you, at least on all the work that I've been doing on human, is again this very provocating work that you've been doing, and Susan mostly on TFH differentiation. So what we know is that TFH provide B cell help, and that B cells produce IL-10. And they're both, of course, present in germinal centers. So there must be a crosstalk between those two molecules, between those two cell types, and maybe IL-10 is involved in mediating that crosstalk. So what we were able to see, in fact, is that IL-10 was correlated to several pathways that are involved in IL-10 differentiation. And of course, as you might expect from the work of Luis Picker and Jim Pantaleo, it was also associated to integrate DNA. And BCL6 is a major transcription factor that regulates TFH differentiation. And you can see that BCL6 is under the control of IL-10. The more IL-10 you add, the more BCL6 you express. And when you add an IL-10, there's a significant downregulation of BCL6 expression. You'll see much more direct data when I go back to the NHP work. But again, what I want, we had the fortunate capacity of monitoring now IL-10 expression in germinal centers and monitoring what cells make IL-10. And so we took hard-to-treat subjects and looked at where IL-10 is being expressed. And if you look at this is healthy controls, absolutely no IL-10 expression. And now if you look at aviremic subjects, they have been through at least 3 years, and look at IL-10 staining by immunocytochemistry, the work of Claire Delage and Jake Estes, you can see that there's a very high frequency of cells that make IL-10, and in fact you find IL-10 not only in the B-cell follicle, but also in the T-cell zone and in the marginal zone. So showing in fact that when that in a hard-to-treat subjects, and these are data collected on an average of 5 different subjects, I mean that phenomenon is happening all throughout the lymph nodes, suggesting again that probably many different cell types are producing IL-10. And this is exactly what I'm showing here. Is now you look at the expression, the frequency of cells that are making IL-10. You can find them in the monocytes, in CD68, CD163 positive cells, and you can find them also in B cells and in CD4 T cells. And now, if you go back and now look at directly at the real data, you can see that those cells express, which are CD4 positive, can be PD-1 high. You have here cells that are expressing. I'm sorry, the arrows are too small, I mean, for you to be able to visualize that. But you can see that among the cells that make IL-10, so the IL-10 positive cells, you have cells which are either PD-1 high or cells which are PD-1 negative, and we know in fact that those cells are CTLA-4 negative. We know also that CD20 positive cells, so B cells, also are cells that make IL-10. And in fact, when you look at in a spatial-temporal fashion, when you look at where those IL-10 positive cells are localized, these are the green cells. They're localized in the vicinity of cells that make viral DNA or that have viral DNA, again suggesting, because I mean they're close to each other, that maybe IL-10 is involved in the maintenance of HIV DNA positive. And these are in fact, I mean, derived from subjects that have been treated for at least 3 years, indicating that even 3 years later, you still see in the lymph node cells that are making IL-10 and could contribute to the establishment of the latent virus. And if now you look at germinal center like B cells and you monitor their frequencies, you see in fact that they're a very direct correlate of cells that have total HIV DNA. Again, there's a very significant correlation between HIV DNA and the frequency of those cells, which are GC-like. So, at the end, what I've been able to show you from all these experiments is that IL-10 is being produced by monocytes, by B cells, by T cells, and that leads, I mean, to the upregulation of co-inhibitory receptor, to the reprogramming of, to the modulation of chromatin and induction of HDACs, which are going to inhibit cell transcription. It's going to induce the differentiation of T cells to Tregs, which are a major bona fide reservoir in germinal centers, and that altogether is going to contribute to maintenance of HIV latency. What also I did not tell you, because we have not yet done any experiment to confirm that, is that IL-10 is a very potent immune suppressor. You put CD8 T cells in the presence of IL-10, and in fact, it's going to completely inhibit T cell activation and CD8 cell function. So by removing IL-10, by finding ways by which can remove IL-10, it's very likely that it can eventually reprogram CD8 T cells to become, again, functional. So, of course, I mean, I mentioned to you in the beginning, my goal is not just to do great science or good science, which I think we do, but also to try to develop interventions that can lead eventually to HIV eradication. So we have a molecule, IL-10, that increases survival of infected cells, increases the expression of co-inhibitory receptors, which are direct mechanisms that trigger HIV latency, that trigger epigenetic modification that also upstream of HIV latency, and increase the number of reservoir-bearing cells. So you can imagine that with an anti-IL-10 antibody, if you had a strategy that involved inhibition of IL-10 production or inhibition of IL-10 signaling, you might be able, to decrease all these mechanisms that contribute to HIV latency. So, of course, we cannot do any of these interventions or think of doing intervention in human before we test them at least in non-human primates. And so with Mirko Berardini at Emory, and Mirko is going to be here next week, we were able, first to confirm that the non-human primate model was a valid model to do the experiment. So we show, in fact, that when you infect monkeys with SIV, you increase the upregulation of IL-10, and even under heart, like I showed you, after heart treatment, you can see, in fact, that IL-10 values are still much higher than they were at compared to baseline. And in fact, we show also that IL-10, as we had seen in human, is a strong predictor of plasma viremia, and that's work that you had published a few years ago with Ella Said. And we also showed, in fact, that IL-10 was the direct correlate of low CD4 numbers in those infected subjects that pre-art. So, and also, as I showed you in human, IL-10 was also associated to cells that express several activation markers like HLA-DR and CD8. So all those biomarkers that we had observed in human, we can reproduce them into an HIV-infected macaques. What also was very, very interesting in the work that Mirko had done is that we were able to correlate the pre-art plasma levels of IL-10 with the levels of cell-associated DNA and cell-associated RNA after treatment, so even 250 days after initiation of treatment. And as I showed you earlier, we were able to show, in fact, that the IL-10 expressing cells were present in the B-cell follicles, in the T-cell zone, in the medulla, and of course in the T-cell zone. And again, IL-10 and SIV RNA positive cells were again co-localized together within the lymph node. And in that slide where I showed you, but I'm sure you cannot see, when you merge, B cells and IL-10, you can see that, in fact, there's a very strong frequency of B cells which are also making IL-10. And again, getting back to the points I mentioned to you, we can see that this IL-10 is being expressed by CTLA-4 positive cells, so bona fide Tregs, and which make IL-10, and those CTLA-4 cells can make both IL-10 and TGF-beta, again confirming that the role of Tregs in making the IL-10 that eventually is going to contribute to HIV latency. So then, of course, Stark gets the real experiment. The real experiment now is treating monkeys with an anti-IL-10, which is going to interrupt the cycle, and eventually try to see now whether that's going to have an impediment on the HIV reservoir. So I'm going to tell you right now, we still don't have those data, but we have a lot of very encouraging data showing that intervention can work to some extent, and hopefully within the next 6 weeks, we'll be able to show an effect on the reservoir. But everything seems to indicate that hopefully it's going to work. So Merck, my colleague at Merck, Dara Zuda and Dan Gorman, have a very good anti-IL-10 antibody, which is now being used in cancer, in treatment of cancer, subjects with cancer. And they did an incredible effort in making macacized form of the anti-IL-10 that you can use now in non-human primate. So we got funding from the NIH and were able to do an experiment where we treated monkeys for 217 days, a little bit less than 217 days, about 6 months, yes, with antivirals, and then we added the anti-IL-10, one dose at 10 milligram per kilo, and then a second dose at 20 milligram per kilo after 6 months of treatment. And what we monitored first is the surrogate markers of IL-10, like STAT3. I told you, the first molecule that IL-10 hits, and that controls whatever IL-10 is relating is STAT3. And you can see that when you take IL-10, treated monkeys, and you put them in the presence of IL-10, only one dose is able now to lead to a significant decrease in the index of STAT3. It also has a significant effect on B cells. I mentioned to you that IL-10 is a is a survival factor of B cells, and you could see that, in fact, the frequency of B cells also decreased upon IL-10 addition. And I mentioned to you that IL-10 is a TFH differentiation factor, and again, when you add IL-10, you can see a very significant decrease in IL-10, and that's only 15 days after a single injection of IL-10. We have data coming up with now the second injection. And I may also indicate to you from the human studies, in fact, that IL-10 triggers several exhaustion markers, like CTLA4 and like PD-1, and now you add the anti-IL-10 in vivo, in those monkeys, you can see that a single dose of IL-10 is able to decrease significantly the expression of CTLA4, of PD-1 on both CT4 and PD-1, and also on LAG3. So again, confirming the data that we have in human and in monkeys, that IL-10 is very much involved in regulating those exhaustion markers, which are critical for this type of latency, and that allows us, now to think that hopefully we'll be able to see an effect on the reservoir. So IL-10 production helps the survival of infected cells. You get increased viral production. You get infection of new cells because you have now PD-1 interacting with PD-L1 or LAG3 interacting with this ligand or CD4, CD80. Now you induce latency, and those latently infected cells, hopefully we can interrupt all this effect by adding an anti-IL-10 in vivo, and these are experiments that hopefully will have very good answers in the next few weeks. So I think, that's our way, one of the ways, that by which we are trying to look at an HIV functional cure, because, we think that the anti-IL-10 is going to work not only on the establishment of maintenance of latency by modulating the survival of infected cells, but also by restoring HIV-specific CD8 and CD4 T cell function. So in the next few weeks, we'll be able to get an assessment of reservoir measurements. One thing also that we are very looking at very carefully is that the safety. Right now we're looking at, because IL-10 is very much involved in gut dysbiosis and IBD, and so we are very careful about making sure that the anti-IL-10 is not going to affect that. From the data we have, looking at 50 biochemical and hematological markers, we don't see any effect of safety. We're doing some histology now to confirm this. This is still a happy group. People think that my lab is a lab where people, just sweat and work and are hardly able to survive, but they still smile. And I just want to highlight, the work of Susan, and who did a lot of the work, and is hopefully writing the paper, which we will send soon. Malika provided a lot of the bioinformatics support. Frank Dupuis started his work in Montreal. Dan Gorman and Darazuda at Merck are providing us with all the new generation of antibodies that we're going to be hopefully using in human. And of course, Mirko and Justin are very much involved in doing all the monkey work and work closely in collaboration with us to translate and communicate the work between human and monkeys. That's it. And if you want to get more details about this presentation, Susan is here. You can talk to her, and she'll be happy to provide you with any answer you want.
A gente tem perguntas da plateia.
Very nice talk. I'm Giulio Lorenzi from Rockefeller University. In your last experiment with the monkeys, you expect that after the dose of IL-10 you should have blips, or a lower IUPM count in the end when you sack the monkeys? You expect viral blips after the IL-10 injections, because you have like...
I think that's a very, very good question. I think right now we are doing single cell RNA, not single cell, single copy RNA measures in the plasma. We should have data very soon. I think because everyone is focused on the reservoir, we are measuring the reservoir using QOA using the new P27 assay that Merck has developed. That's very, very sensitive. So we should have those data. But I think yes, you would expect to see viral blips. But I think you will probably need single copy RNA to be able to monitor that.
And just a little bit more in the reservoir side, you believe that all the cells that are with this IL-10 high levels, and you're always correlated with proviral integrated DNA, and we know that most of these viruses are actually defective. You think this is the effect of this dummy virus, or is the effect of all the real virus too?
So your question is whether IL-10 also induces the defective virus?
Yeah, because most of your data you correlate with integrated DNA, right?
Yeah, but I mentioned in the first slide that everything that we correlate with integrated DNA, we're also able to correlate with TILDA, which is the viral activation assay that Nicolas Chamois and I have developed. But I agree with you. I mean that at the end of the day, what we want to be able to measure is functional HIV activation. So in the LARA assay, in the in vitro assay, everything I mentioned to you is all IL-10 triggers the survival of cells infected with replication competent viral RNA. So that's the best we can do. But hopefully, I think with all the single-cell RNA technology that you have and with the new PCR assays that Bob Silician has developed, we'll be able to look at full integrated competent viral DNA.
Mais perguntas?
Don't be shy, huh?
A Susan quer se identificar, só para todo mundo saber. Parabéns, Susan, pelo trabalho.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.